Tyranitar is RU, and that's crazy because it's been OU its entire life. And with me today to talk about this, we have BKC as always, but we also have two extra guests.
Hey, I'm PokeMMD.
I'm Blunder.
So Tyranitar, as I said, been OU its entire life. It has a bajillion sets. It was the #1 Pokemon in Advanced because it could set up Sandstorm, and the entire metagame revolved around that. And then that, along with spikes like Sandstorm, unless you were a ground, steel, or rock type, you basically had your leftovers canceled, which was huge. And then as the years went on, it would continue to keep doing that. It could be run offensively. It was also the poster child for using Pursuit because its attack is so high. And then even after weather got nerfed and permanent sand was no longer a thing, it still continued to be OU because of its versatility. You can imagine our shock as to Tyranitar. Now we're in Scarlet and Violet, and it's not only is it not in OU, it's not even in UU, it is RU. So what the heck happened?
We should go back to Gen 8 just for a second because it was the generation that buffed ghost types the most, right? We had Dragapult as good as it was, we had Blacephalon as great as it was, and because of the lack of pursuit, Tyranitar eventually fell off, and then it got back because people started to realize just how good Choice Band Tyranitar was as a breaker, despite Landorus, defensive Buzzwole, and everything. Just being able to still resist Shadow Balls from Dragapult and being able to tank knockoff or even just a crash from Pokemon like Weavile really did go a long way. It was also one of the few Pokemon that could take 2 V-Creates from Victini in that metagame itself. But then you fast forward to Generation 9, and as you mentioned, it fell down to RU. This is a lot to do with the #1 Pokemon in the metagame, Great Tusk, right? Great Tusk's natural typing allows it to resist both of Tyranitar's stabs and basically every physical move it could go for. Even Aqua Tail will be shrugged off just because it's such a defensive behemoth. And the one way that Tyranitar can beat Great Tusk is with Tera, whether it be, and usually Tera Fly, in order to take the close combat or Earthquake, have long rush, whatever, and then threaten it back with an Ice Beam. But in order to do that, you have to Terrasilize your Tyranitar. And that's, at that point, it's a waste of a Tyranitar, in my opinion, when we have better rock types in the metagame currently, like Garganacl. That mon is obviously really loves Tera for itself, whether it be water or fairy, to be a better resist.
I think there's something like 8 or 9 ground types in OU, and all of them obviously have a great matchup versus Tyranitar. I had success with 2 Tyranitars when I played through the entirety of Gen 9. Assault Vest, which we always talk about Tyranitar in the past, it's special defensive set, right? It used to check big threats in Gen 5 like Latios. Gen 6, it could still take on a ton of special attackers and so on. But I think Assault Vest in Generation 9 definitely still has a utility. Rock, Dark, even though it has a lot of weaknesses, it's still able to take a lot of these super effective special moves, water type moves, make it rain, that sort of things. I do think Assault Vest Tyranitar is probably the best set it had. And then Choice Specs, which is a novelty set, which, I mean, it's more so for fun and working off the fact that Tyranitar is not going to work as a physical attacker anymore, mainly because Great Tusk exists. And for that reason, like Tyranitar, there's no conceivable way for Tyranitar to break through something like that with a physical move set.
And it just made the mon fall down more and more. Like, we got better unaware mons, so Dragon Dance isn't as strong right now. We have Dondozo, which is incredible in the metagame. And again, in terms of offensive Teras, why would I Terrasilize Tyranitar just to beat one Pokemon when I can Terrasilize King Gambit to beat them all, or Excadrill to beat them all? That's my rationale as to why that mon fell. And on top of that, we even have Zamazenta now in the OU tier with Dauntless Shield to raise its defense. Tyranitar is never breaking that Pokemon.
So there's nothing that T-Tar Sand is useful for, because the whole reason why T-Tar is competitive Pokemon from Gens 2 through, let's say, 7 is Pursuit is a big part of it, of course, but even when T-Tar itself isn't doing much, then just by switching it in, then you kick up Sand. And even when it's not permanent, that can be really big for neutering something's lefties or just getting some extra chip on something like Keldeo. But especially when it's permanent, that alters the fabric of the tier immeasurably. You know, and T-Tar wasn't just great in OU either. It was also really important in Ubers for lots of generations.
Sand Chip is underrated too. The extra 6% is underrated. Most teams, they have a gold plus a ground type plus a gambit or something like that. How I feel is that usually the only 3 or 4 mons on the opponent's team, max it feels 4, are going to get hit by the sand to begin with. But that chip does help, especially now because hail turned into snow. So there is no other type of weather that can do this residual damage.
So I understand now that it's sand doesn't have any particular abusers because there's no Excadrill, right?
Yep, there's no drill. I think that if Excadrill was in the metagame, Tyranitar would probably be more of a partner for it than Hippowdon, just because Hippowdon's a little bit more passive. What do you think, Blender?
Excadrill will be cool when it comes back, but I'm pretty doubtful of whether it would even be able to make Tyranitar go back to OU. Because Sand, like we were talking about, it's not permanent anymore, so it's changed a lot. Tyranitar's utility as a whole, it really goes down, especially with Great Tusk and that sort of thing. I certainly think Excadrill in the Sand is still going to be something that people try out, because that's a tried and true combination now for 4 gens. That's tried and true. 6, 7, and 8, there's always been Sand Excadrill teams. Even if Tyranitar's utility has gone down, the Excadrill partnership, and with Tera, I think that's going to be a big thing. Even if I'm more so talking about Excadrill here, I do think the fact that you need Tyranitar for Excadrill it's still a big deal. That it will help Tyranitar.
Yeah.
So the other question is, what about UU? Not being OU anymore, sure, but what's going on in UU that's so hostile to T-Tar that it's got to go all the way down to RU?
In UU, we had some really big tier changes that eventually happened, which is why Tyranitar ended up falling. But the biggest ones are that we got Meowscarada in the tier, and Meowscarada was #1 in the tier for the use stats for July, right? Because you got to remember that Tyranitar fell to RU in August. Throughout the month of July, the best Pokemon in UU, Meowscarada, Donphan, Cleavor. Cleavor is actually a top tier Pokemon in the tier, right? And a mon that can naturally just spam U-turn for itself. But you also have offensive waters that are top 10 as well, like Greninja and Quaquaval, right? So far, I've give you a list of Pokemon that Tyranitar does not do well versus.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have Scizor, right? You have Scizor, you have Cyclizar, which you can threaten it with knockoff and U-turn, getting its utility. And Tinkaton was also top 8 as well. I mean, if you want me to give you the whole top 10 list, the only mon on this list that actually loses to Tyranitar is Skeleturge. And that's only if it's special Tyranitar hitting it on the switch or Choice Band hitting it on the switch. That was top 10 UU for July. Basically, it was not able to compete. It wasn't able to compete. If I want a rock type, I'm going to use Arcanine or Cleavor. If I want a defensive Pokemon, why use a defensive rock that gets a speed F boost when Tinkaton can take on Gengar just as well, right? So it's lack of breaking power, not to mention Hippowdon was in the tier 2. Yeah, you can get some fun KOs with choice specs, and you were actually one of the few Pokemon that could beat Iron Jugulis, which also fell down to RU. There was just way too much. There's Bisharp as well for you. Like the amount of steel types, and Tera also getting rid of, hey, like 1v1s they're not 1v1s. Right? There's always those other variables you have to think about. But in this case, just the amount of great Pokemon in the UU tier itself and the top Pokemon were just too overwhelming for Tyranitar.
When I look at this tier, you're right. I don't understand why I would bring Tyranitar as an offensive Pokemon.
Ever.
Then if you want to run support and get up Stealth, Cleaver can do that.
Exactly.
Or Donphan can do it if you want a defensive profile.
And Donphan did do it because it was Rapid Spinner with knockoff as well before Cyclizar came. So like on top of that, you had Low Kicks, which was down in UU as well. Hippo as well. If I want a rocker, why would I use like Tyranitar over Hippo? Even Gastrodon, right? Gastrodon was buffed this generation with Spikes and Stealth Rock. I will say in RU though, while Tyranitar didn't end up even, I believe, getting voted on to be a quick banned, they initially banned Gyarados, Iron Jugulis, Iron Leaves, and Mew. Tyranitar wasn't even on the initial list. My initial thoughts were Tyranitar was broken down there. I used Choice Band, and more importantly, I used Dragonits. And then even in top 10 of usage in RU, if you look at the initial, you actually have Iron Thorns at #9, which is basically Tyranitar 4 times weak to ground, right? But it still managed to be a #9 most used Pokemon. But of course, that one has booster energy versus Tyranitar having Speed F boost. So there's a lot of trade-offs there. But I did personally see Tyranitar being crazy in RU. And then after the initial bans that they had with Armarouge and not Armarouge, excuse me, the ones I mentioned, like Iron Leaves, like the booster energy mons eventually going in Gyarados, I do think this is something that's going to be looked at. I don't think it'll stay RU, but of course I could just be wrong because every generation we're surprised, right? The fact that Tyranitar even fell.
Yeah, so that just makes me think of how this generation is so much different from all the others. Because you know how when you look at the OUs of past generations, and it tends to be the same Pokemon over and over. It's always Heatran, Pharaoh, Lando, Latios, T-Tar, Keldeo. What generation is that a team from? You don't even know. But then there are all these gradual changes, and T-Tar still keeps up with them because, yeah, there are gradual changes, like fairy types, that's a big one. Yeah. And T-Tar can still keep up with that because it's still largely the same dynamic. And it's especially what you guys were saying about how it doesn't switch into anything anymore. where it used to be that T-Tar switched into everything. That's why it kept getting used over and over again. You would constantly get opportunities to do that. Because I was thinking, does it get better if it has Pursuit? Obviously it does in Gen 9, but does it get good enough to be OU? And I mean, you guys would know better than me, but I'm thinking it might not be as easy a yes answer as you might think, just because of how little it switches into. So it feels like this gen, they went out of their way to add so many new Pokemon, all of which are either outclassing it, like in the guard case, or are hitting it super effectively. Like all these new Pokemon that you're mentioning, or all the Pokemon that you're mentioning that threaten it every which way, they all seem to be new. And those that aren't new, then they really take advantage of the new direction the meta game has gone in, specifically centering around fairy types in particular, or new forms of dark type and ghost type offense. Ghost type getting indirectly incredibly buffed by the lack of Pursuit. But when your game center around more of that and less of the same dynamics that T-Tar was so good at before, revolving around Pursuit and less of an emphasis on Ghost and Fairy kind of stuff, then it's of course going to be, it doesn't really become that surprising that it's dropped this far down, because it's such a completely different game. More so, it feels like this is way more of a different generation than all the previous generations, just because of how different the new pool of Pokemon is.
Yeah, another example, if you actually look at something like that, Garchomp is barely hanging on to OU as it is right now, too. And it's considered by many, me included, the best pseudo, just overall, like all around, right? I put like that, T-Tar, Dragonite, Dragapult up there, right? Garchomp itself is also finding itself in a similar role due to, we mentioned Tinglu, we mentioned Great Tusk, and also we have a Namorous now, like the offensive fairy Namorous, and also we have every other fairy that Pokemon can just turn into, right? There's so many, fairy and water are probably the two most common Tera types, as well, that just naturally shut down that, and Garchomp is a more extreme case, but like Tyranitar just, it cannot keep it up. It just doesn't have a role. It literally doesn't have a role. If I want a rocker that's a rock type, I'll use Guard or Glamora, because Glamora, even by accident dying, will get a Toxic Spikes.
It's also one of those Pokemon that just so greatly does not benefit from Tera, since the Spadef boost that Rock gets from Sand is so necessary for this.
Oh, that's horrible. Yeah, I tried already to mourn its passing of sorts, and I Terra'd my T-Tar, and I took damage from my own Sand. It was such a horrible feeling.
You felt violated, right? Like, how is this even real?
I'll live at 5%, and then I'll be fine, because I Terra'd, and then I died to my own Sand. It was appalling. That should not happen.
It was appalling.
Yeah,
that is
was my last time playing RU.
He's right though, because especially if you're using Dragon Dance Tyranitar, right? You're probably gonna want Lumberry on it. You're not gonna want leftovers on your Dragon Dance Tyranitar. I want more opportunities.
I want weakness policy. I want that power. You know what
exactly.
I mean?
Can't even take advantage.
If you do that, then you Tera, and then every time you switch your T-Tar in after, you're summoning Sand. You're summoning Sand with a Pokemon that is hit by Sand.
Yeah, I mean, I became a flying type and switched into Stealth Rock, took 25%, and then killed myself with Sand. And I think a video.
That just comes with the territory of Tera, at least. Setting up your field condition that hurts you, that's just awful.